Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and all the other times that apply. Thank you for coming here and leaving this beautiful sunny Southern California. Missing on the sunshine out there, I guess. Let me start with a short poem titled "In the Prison of Perception." In the midst of darkened seas, our shadows still project a scribbly silhouette on the othered face of God. From refracted revelations, we carve niches and white spaces. We make places, we make people with identities galore. In heaped high stratifications, we can see complementarities of colors, hues, and shades, fine distinctions of that paintbrush held divine. We indulge in introspection as we distance to disown askance appearance, contemplating mirrored images. But the mirror doesn't flinch, nor does it blink, defies effacing the true image we disdain. We can't change, we break the mirror. Shattered crystals hold persistence of reflections. As I think I'm making this a tradition, the poem is a little long, so I will read the second half as a conclusion. But I also wanted to add a disclaimer. That is, that our discussion is philosophical and not necessarily religious. The necessarily is underlined. It is theosophical in the sense that we are not preaching, but teaching. Teaching in the sense that we share perspectives and exchange ideas with the understanding that it is much better to comfortably disagree with one another than to uncomfortably agree. I hope you agree. I also wanted to add the second point is that the two lectures, one from last week, one from today, are interconnected, so if I'm making reference to things I talked last week, I hope they are not too boring for those of you who hear it the second time, and I hope they are not too puzzling for those who hear it for the first time. And as for those of you who are hearing me for the first time, it's also my style to be blunt. Blunt not to offend anyone's religious beliefs and convictions, but to be blunt so that I can be clear. So today's talk follows on the talk we had last week, which was simply in reference to the concept of God globally. We made short reference to the people of the earth God in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, and the people of the sky God, that's a general category for people in the eastern half, Asia, Europe, Africa, and Australia, well, probably Australia too. And so while that general categorization is fine in the sense that when people look for God, they have to look somewhere. And the awareness, the placeness of God is, in principle, is something that we deny because we believe God is omnipresent, God is everywhere. But the human endeavor doesn't leave us alone, so we have to look somewhere. Like when we pray, we do have a qibla, but do we need one? If we think God is everywhere, then every direction is your qibla. But we choose one simply for the sake of conformity, for the sake of identifying with a community of faith, and so on. So now that the earth and sky distinction has been made, let me delve into the second categorization, which we will be discussing today. We will leave the earth God people alone. Unfortunately, we didn't do that in history. But we'll go to the sky God people. Those, at least for the sake of our discussion, I will divide them into three categories. The Eastern religions, the Middle Eastern religions, and the Western religions. The Western religions are religions where their gods are primarily their heroes, the heroes of myths and epics and stories, the Iliads and the Odyssey and the Greek pantheons, the gods of the Teutonic Germanic gods, the gods of the Irish and the Sams and the Albanians, not today's Albanians, the ethnic Albanians of the past. So that is the Western tradition, that the gods are tangible. They generally project human attributes on the divine. These gods wrestle, they fight, they win wars, and so on. The Eastern gods or the Eastern traditions are the traditions of personal experience. Whatever belief they have, or they may have, of the supernatural, of the metaphysical, has to do with their understanding, however limited that might be. Nobody needs to convince anyone. And so they try to experience that personally. And then the Middle Eastern faiths, these are faith communities. For the Middle Eastern ones, we often emphasize the word faith. For the Eastern ones, we emphasize tradition. And for the Westerns, we emphasize the myths. And the myth doesn't mean it's not a reality, that it is beyond the sense reality. And also the Middle Eastern traditions have, in addition to faith community, they also have scriptures. And the scriptures are considered revelations. And these are words that reveal the other side of reality, so that humans can have some understanding of it. And so therefore we go from the heart for the Easterners, for the mind for the Middle Easterners, and to the heroes in the Westerners. And let me move on to defining the terms. I think the major contrast we will have to do would be between Eastern religions and Middle Eastern religions. And the reason is that the Western religions of the Greeks and the Teutonics and the Egyptians, these have all converted to a Middle Eastern religion. So Europeans believe in Jesus, and Jesus was a Middle Easterner, and therefore the Western religion is, if not relevant, at least has been marginalized. So we will compare the Middle Easterners with the Easterners. And these I will categorize in terms of organized religion versus organic religion. Those of you who are into the health food, this will be good food for your thoughts. Organic religion. They see God within every atom of the sense world, and therefore God is omnipresent and is prevalent throughout nature. These would be religions such as Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, Shamanism, etc. So the organic religions or referred to in that context as religions of a personal conviction where the person is the personal identity and the personal experience is emphasized, but the collective is not. By contrast, the organized religions, they have a systematic structure. They believe in a supreme being as the creator and the originator of all things. Then there is also the created world, so the creator and the created. We in the Middle Eastern traditions make that distinction, but in the Eastern traditions they don't. And so this organized religion has its hierarchical cosmology, in which the supreme being is at the top, and it has primacy and power over all things, perceived or otherwise. And as the narratives and the revelations then tell us, we are convinced that at some level there's nothing that we can do unless it's willed from above, from God. Which might be okay for your own personal sense of comfort. But then, if misinterpreted, a lot of people become so indifferent to worldly affairs. If they say, Inshallah or MashaAllah, they just leave themselves out of the equation. And in my opinion, that is a kind of an abuse of that. The idea of that God, that supreme being, as we talked about it last week, it has to be, because it's beyond the level of the human knowledge, therefore it has at least to be acknowledged. But perhaps this is my critique of the organized religion. Perhaps the worst part of the organizational religion is its social structure, because it emphasizes group identity instead of the individual identity. It's important for a person to be a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, or Zoroastrian, then there's not as much emphasis on what the person believes in. A person could, out of peer pressure or social cohesion, simply claim one of these faiths, and nobody asks any question. Subhanallah, MashaAllah, and all these invocations will pour upon the person, and nobody even asks a question like, yeah, if you believe in God, what is your belief? We don't care about their personal, just act like, because like I said, it's the group identity that is important. And so therefore adherence to this group identity makes these kind of religions tribal. And so we build loyalties, not on being right or wrong. We build loyalties on whether we belong to this or the other group. And as Mr. Wasit was referring to Ayah 62 of Al-Baqarah, whereas the Quran clearly says these people, those who believe in God and in the hereafter and do good, have nothing to fear. That's what their God says. But then you ask the people, they say no. Anyone who can go to heaven would have to believe the way they personally understand. So therefore they monopolize the truth. So in that sense, just to sum it up, that the organized religions, it's more important to understand the God without than the God within. They disagree with each other. If it's not Muslims and Christians, then you go within Christian. There are schools of thought within Christianity that are each other's throat, and there are schools of Muslim thought, of Jewish thought, of any group. The thing is that this monopolization of a perceived notion of the divine is seen through a personal perspective, but then because the community is emphasized, then you automatically expect of the entire community to believe as you do, or they are going to go to hell. So then the conviction is one of an interpretation of the revelation. So in the final analysis, it is not so much mind over matter, but rather revelation over reason. So once you make reason secondary, again, contrary to everything the Quran says, when the Quran says, these are signs for those who think. So the Quran appeals to your reason, and yet you, subject your reason to a revelation, not so much as the revelation itself, but your interpretation and understanding of it. So then if you say, well, if they disagreed so much with one another, there must be a very wide rift philosophically. Not so. The ones who disagree the most are the ones who are most ignorant of their own traditions, whatever the tradition. The most fanatic Muslims, the most fanatic Jews, the most fanatic Christians are the ones who are usually with a lot of power and result in cause a lot of destruction. But when you go to the Muslim philosopher, the Christian thinker, and a Jewish rabbi, they are probably, if not hugging each other, certainly sitting very close to one another because they understand things from a different perspective. So then to take a look at the Greek thought, which we talked about last time, this would be Aristotle's the concept of the unmoved mover, that which moves without being moved, or the prime mover. It's a concept advanced by him as the prime mover in the sense that there can be only one prime mover. So what rights do these various faith communities have to monopolize it? The Islamic concept, again, at the philosophical level, is pretty much the same. We are talking about Abu Ali ibn Sina, or Avicenna, who inquired into the question of being, in which he distinguished between two important things. One would be the essence of the divine, the mahiyya, and the other one is the existence, or the wujud. And he argues that the fact of existence could not be inferred from or accounted for by the essence of existing things, and that form and matter by themselves could not originate and interact with the movement of the universe or the progressive actualization of existing things. Thus, he reasoned that existence must be due to an agent caused that necessitates, imparts, gives, or adds existence to an essence. To do so, the cause must coexist with its effect and be an existing thing. Everybody understand that, right? I mean, I've read it over many, many times. It's not easy to understand because, just as lawyers want to make English a little more difficult, philosophers are not that far behind. The idea is that if we separate the concept of the mahiyya, or the existence of God, which would have to be in some form or shape, identifiable or sense, from that of the existence of God, which is logically, you say, there has to be someone. Doesn't matter if I can prove it or not. But these two would go hand in hand because if one is causing the other, then they must exist at the same time. And if they must exist in the same time, remember that first argument, then the primacy of God is not there. Which is that we are of God, and we have come into existence with God, and that nothing existed except God. And when now things do exist, they could not have come from a void. It had to have come from God. Which brings us back right into the Buddhist thought. We are all organic, created together. The God within as much as the human. And then we could also look at the more Western or scientific interpretation, which is based on the observation that which you see in the galaxies above and those that you see in the microbes below, in other words, the largest physical bodies, celestial bodies, along with microscopic ones, they have the exact same structure. That they go around the spinning around certain, neutrons, protons, and all the other nuclei. And so therefore, an atom proved strikingly similar to a solar system. So the size is only relative. Because we are smaller than one and bigger than the other, then we decide, but who are we? And so if you continue this discussion, you reach the conclusion, as above, so below. So all the forms, small or big, in the universe are the same. And Isaac Newton summarizes this: "'Tis true without lying, certain and most true. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below." Then science reaches the same conclusion. I mean, we don't have to cross our heart or raise our hands in prayer, but the truth is there. Then we come to the mystical interpretation of whether the organic or the organized are on the right track. So all mystical traditions of the monotheistic type adhere to some form of a unity in thought, but Islam's mystical tradition in particular comes pretty close, and the reason it comes closer than the Jewish and the Christian and perhaps Zoroastrianism is that, one, we could say it is its proximity to the East. It's Islam that borders Buddhism and Hinduism. And the other argument we can make is that Islam from its beginning was a religion of inclusion and inclusivity, not rejecting those who disagreed with him, but rather bringing them into the fold. In fact, the whole Islamic civilization was the result of the contributions of the Muslims, the Hindus, the Persians, the Africans, the Turks, and whoever else. Whatever they brought to the table is what formed the Islamic civilization. Now that is at the science and history level, but in religion too. The word Sufism might come from the word Sophia, the goddess of wisdom in Greek thought. It might come from Safa, the purity. It might have come from the Suf that the Christian mystics used to wear, a woolen cloth that was deliberately made to be uncomfortable so that they won't fall asleep, but will be in the constant remembrance of the divine. The Sufis do the same. And I see this beautiful lady in the front row with a long gown, which reminds me of the caps and gowns that, when do people wear those? During graduations. And I've heard many lectures, people thinking or describing it as this is a great Western tradition. Not at all. It is the Sufi tradition. When a Sufi student would graduate, the master, Sufi, the Sheikh, will put his turban on his head and give him his own gown, following the tradition of Uwais Qarani, who was given the mantle of the Prophet himself. And then when you tuck that turban around, you put it from this side to here. Well, in the West they didn't have turbans, so they used tassels. They didn't have the amman, so they're using the caps. They didn't have the long gowns like the Prophet was wearing, so it's the same thing. Now, the reason I'm making reference to that is that Islam was not shying away from including whatever good they found in any tradition. However, some cultures, like the example I give you, they show that sensitivity. In the Christian West, nobody is ever going to acknowledge that the caps and gowns and graduations in our colleges and universities actually come from the Muslims. That was a footnote there to go back to our own argument, is that perhaps it's this mystic tradition of Islam that is again all-inclusive, and since we don't have much time, I will simply mention that whether you refer to it as tasawwuf, irfan, or Sufism, the idea is that they all talk about the oneness of being, wahdatul wujud, which was a term coined by Abu Madian and popularized by Ibn al-Arabi back in the 12th century. And the idea of this oneness of being harkens back to the Hindu thought and to the Buddhist thought I was talking about, that we have all been created together, that the God within can never be without, that there is a divine within us. So the problem we have generally is that the organized religion or dogmatic religion sticks too much to the literal interpretation of the text. And that's when you get in trouble. The literal, the fundamental, the fundamentalist, and you know where that takes us. Whereas the mystical traditions usually go to the allegorical, the symbolic, because you cannot be talking about a literal God in the literal sense if you don't even have the faculties to discern and feel and sense and observe that entity. So it must be allegory, and that's why when we use the allegories, Islam has a clear place for that. The 99 names of God, what are they? We are not talking about 99 gods. And some people who may misunderstand Islam might just say that. Muslims believe in 99 gods. Just like when we take the different attributes of God that are manifested in the different deities of the European pantheon, the god of fire, the god of flood, the god of this and that, and then we say, yeah, they have so many gods. Not so. And then we also can compare that to even closer interpretations in terms of, for instance, when we talk about the absolute in terms of the oneness, or let's say the concept of Trinity, to which Muslims are so sensitive. There is a Hindu Trinity. The God, the attributes of God are divided into three: the Vishnu, which is the God that preserves; the Shiva, the God that destroys; and of course Brahma, the God that creates. And then if you take the Christian Trinity, which comes from the Egyptian Trinity, that's a whole other story. In there, insofar as God knows himself, we're talking about God as the Son. Insofar as God is the knower, that is the Father. And the knowing process itself is the Holy Spirit. So yeah, there's a kind of a classification, dissection, however you want to look at it. But in reality, the oneness of God is accepted and understood. And today is the 11th, the 17th is St. Patrick's Day. If you can remember his struggle trying to convince the Irish as to how there was one God, but three manifestations. I mean, he used the shamrock, just to throw in something there. So then we can go also to the concept of many of the ideas that we mostly talk about. that in the context of the organized religion, remember last week we talked about God as power, God as presence, but I also refer to God as morality, God as good, and evil, devil, the words are right there, they tell you. So when you make judgment on the good and the bad, that has become a good tool in the hands of the monotheists. And monotheism by itself is not a problem. It becomes a problem when monotheism crosses with a monopolistic thought. So if you think there is one God, that's not a problem. But when you begin to say that there is one God, and that is the God that I know, that is monopoly. And so it's the monopolistic attitude of the monotheists that causes a problem, which results in the following: that every monopolistic monotheist believes that theirs is the only right way, and that makes the rest of the world wrong. And the most illogical aspect of this is that suppose there is a group of 2, 3, 4, 10 million people who believe that they are right and everyone else is wrong, then God did not have the power to turn the whole humanity into the right, except for these few people here. So God has failed in his creation, in essence, because everybody else is wrong. And take that 5 or 10 million people, the attitude of those 5 or 10 million people, they could be Muslims, they could be Christians, they could be any of these monopolistic, monotheistic traditions. And to them, and because of their point of view, the human history is stained with blood. We can start with today. The Yazidis, who had been Yazidis, Yazid means God, for millennia, not for centuries, for millennia. All of a sudden they become unbelievers, and so somebody has to eliminate them. It's from this kind of view that even some of the Eastern religions, like in Myanmar, in Burma, and I'm sure you know the plight of the Rohingyas, okay? The Buddhists were supposed to be based on personal experience, but all of a sudden they say, well, oh no, I mean, if Muslims and Christians can do it, we can do it too. So they enter the realm of religious tribalism, and all of a sudden the Rohingyas, who had been there for centuries, living peacefully with everyone else, and it wasn't anyone's business how they believed in God, all of a sudden become the enemy of the state and the enemy of the society, and they had to be eliminated. And we have many more examples of the pogroms of the Jews in Eastern Europe, but perhaps the worst of them all is the greatest genocide in human history, which is that of the Earth God people in the Americas. 86% of the entire population of the Americas was eliminated for what reason? For a different God. And it's very difficult to argue that that can be godly, let alone saying that it could be approved by God. So we drag God into the from the personal into the public, and the justification is these theocratic tendencies when then religion mixes up with politics, and that's when some people come and they want to defend what? They want to defend Islam. I just can't understand it. Most of these people are so ignorant, you just tell them, like, I mean, how dare you? You could, I feel like telling them that. I mean, since when? Where were you for the last 14 centuries when Islam did not need any defense? They come and defend Christianity, the faith of Jesus, the same thing. So Then there are others who work on the basis of the concept of the chosen people. If these are chosen, so again, God made a whole lot of mistake by not choosing the other ones, or does that show the defect in creation? Or rather, that the chosen be interpreted as those tasked with a duty, assigned with a mission, not the sense of chosen being superior to others. Then there are others who use the concept of the manifest destiny, the white man's burden. There are so many of these terms, including some of the most common vocabulary, like in our times, how often we Muslims feel defensive trying to tell people that's not what jihad means. It's the most abused word in our modern reality. Doesn't matter what it means. What it means is how it is abused and how many people have been killed by using that word. And I think it was Angela Merkel who recently commented that in the Muslim world, those who kill, those who victimize, says God is greater. And those who are being victimized also say God is greater. Like, if they disagree, the wording is the same. Nonetheless, they keep killing. And then you go to India, for instance, where there are thousands of religions, and nobody considers it anybody's business to quantify God or to describe God's power in relation to something else. And nobody's killing anyone, whether you believe in God or not, regardless of whether God is greater or not. So then, if this is in the case of war, we also have the same thing in the case of peace. So even if peace is imposed, sometimes you go from concepts such as the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire, we will conquer the whole world and it will be all peaceful because we would have destroyed all the armies and nobody will be resisting us, right? Peace, wonderful. Or Pax Britannica, the sun never sat on their empire, so they were right. And we also have Pax Islamica, sometimes interpreted or said in the original Arabic as Dar al-Islam, or the establishment of Khilafah. If the Khilafah is what the Daesh or ISIS wants to establish, one wonders what role model are they following, or for that matter, the Boko Haram. So it's very important that we, in retrospect, reflect within, and that we have to give up the tribalism, that just because Christians would criticize Muslims and we come to the Muslims' defense because we are Muslims, no. We have to come to the defense of anyone who's right. But then comes the question of what right? And the right is that everybody's right for themselves. Otherwise, if we want to make others right based on our interpretation, then we got trouble. So then in the religious context, the word worship becomes less important than the word of ownership, because we own the truth. We establish the truth, we claim the truth. So it doesn't matter that you worship, but it matters whether you worship like me or not. So I can accept you. So I can help not chop off your head. Sorry to use the vulgarity that are around us, but I'm doing that deliberately so we can face that reality. So we could then come to a conclusion in the sense that since we have got this monopolistic, monotheistic tradition, like the two words go together, what is the way out? Without the doubt, and without and within, all of those would work. That, to me, doubt is your best teacher. if you never had doubt about anything, you're probably not awake. So the awakeness is not the opening of the eyes, but the opening of the mind. And when the mind is open, it is programmed to keep questioning even your own existence. And if it keeps asking questions and you have never found enough answers to it, that means whatever you believe in it right now, that might be the truth, may not be the truth tomorrow. Unless you say you found it and you close your mind and you don't want to look for it. But we are supposed to be looking for truth from cradle to grave. And if that's so, then the truth you believe in right now is relative. It's relative. It's more than what you knew yesterday, and it's less than what you will know tomorrow. So it's not worth killing for it. Because if you happen to be wrong tomorrow through your own understanding, then you might have as well have killed yourself too. And why do we have to kill? If God meant for us to be thinking for others, on behalf of others, God would have given some of us the head, the brain, the mind, and others would not have had it. Well, that guy's thinking for everybody else, but that's not so. There's a head over everyone's shoulder. Everyone is responsible for their action, and everyone's understanding of the divine is their understanding. And all truth is relative because only God is absolute. Anytime you claim to be absolutely right, you're claiming to be God. You may not use the words, but your action is such. And as good Muslims, if you want to avoid shirk or association with the divine, there's no greater shirk than claiming the attributes of God that are only God's. Remember who else did that? Iblis. Because God's exclusive attribute was his greatness, arrogance if you want to call it. And someone came and claimed that. And the same thing goes for the shirk or the association. So let me conclude with the second half of the poem, and then we'll have a little more time for questions that may not be answerable. Shadows trace our projection, recreating the created. We create even great gods in our image, then claim opposite as truth. Narcissistically, we worship these projections. We prostrate in adoration, retain gestures in elation, spiraling circles of illusion, a circumference in search of a lost center. For too long, shadows have claimed us in their own distorted darkness, tracing self in its own paces, from now here to nowhere to nowhere. Ah, the virtues to be different, of indifference to be one with every being. Leave the solace of seclusion, fly away to the far distanced blue horizons beneath freshly painted clouds on the edge of great divide, to awareness in wholeness, where matter doesn't matter and mind surely doesn't mind. In divine domain splendor, in essential beauty's glances, remain still to be reflected in all beings once again. Thank you.
Any questions? We can take 2 questions, inshallah. After the prayer, we can continue. You go ahead.
Thank you. I'm in agreement, and a lot of things you're saying. My question respectful of other people's beliefs and whatnot, but for example, if you run into Hitler or someone who's really got harmful ideas, to what extent should be respectful of their opinions and their beliefs? I think I'm just kind of trying to see if we can have a boundary or how we treat people with really harmful ideas. Should we still say, well, I respect his opinion?
I don't respect every opinion, but I respect every human to have one. And that's the difference. I would respect Hitler as a person, but because his person would include a lot of other things, not this one idea. But if it comes to his sense of being above the rest of humanity, being racist, to put it bluntly, then I would disrespect that, I would disagree with that, and I will fight it as much as I can. I will try to prevent it. I would consider that my ethical, moral, and human duty to fight against a harmful idea. Doesn't matter where it comes from and how it is coined and made pleasant. You know, we went and supposedly established democracy in Iraq too. So are we going to fight against democracy, or are we going to fight against people who bring injustice to a society? And so that has been claimed by every ideology. Communism was supposed to be a beautiful idea that tried to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and shelter the homeless. But then we saw in the course of 70 years that it probably did everything else except that. Islam is a religion of peace. And regardless of how we justify or speak against the realities and the political realities in the world, the thing is that in our times, those who claim Islam as their religion are not doing anything that makes sense. That one would say, this is what created the Islamic civilization. The violence is there. The genocides are there. We close our eyes on them. The greatest crime that we commit against women, March 8th, was only 2 days ago. We Muslims do it more than anyone else. The imposition of this patriarchal order, which then we label to be Quranic, for instance, not at all. So those are the things that we can respect a person, but not. I hear that from a lot of people. You know, I respect your opinion. No, I respect you to have one, but once you say it, then I can make my decision whether I would respect it or not.
One more question.
How do you see this possible to train people to think this way?
Sorry?
How do you see it possible to train people to think this way? It's so hard to move brains and to move ideas and to move structure and tradition.
Well, if people stay aware and awake, okay, and that's done through education. There's no need for training. There's a need for awareness. When you look at the Muslim civilization, it rose to prominence when Muslims were more educated than anyone else. When Muslims brought paper from China, where in all of Europe there were only 18 books because there wasn't enough papyrus to write on. Whereas Muslims made it so popular, following the edicts of the Quran. Learning is incumbent upon every Muslim man and woman. So look at the gender element, that's very explicitly stated there. So when Muslims were doing that, that every Muslim man and woman should learn, then we rose to prominence. But when the Muslims of our time come and say, girls don't need to go to school, like in some places I didn't need to mention, okay?
But we're talking about those of today.
Exactly. So it's the ignorance that's a problem. So when the Arabic language, which you speak much better than I do, when we talk about dhulumat, the allegory of darkness equated to ignorance is there for a purpose. So how could you accept a revelation? How could things could be revealed to you, which needs light to see, when you're in the darkness? So when you're in the darkness, revelation is nullified because you don't see it. And so the problem is there, that we are lacking education, and whatever education we have back there in the Middle East, Middle West, whatever you want to call it, that is simply an imitative aspect of Western educational systems. But of their own faith and of their own religion, Muslims know the least. Most Muslims have become Christian. I wish they had become Christians like the Christians of the 21st century, but they have become the Christians of the Dark Ages. They have become, they have adopted the worst of almost every tradition. And just because they put the label Muslim or Islam on it, or just because they shout Allahu Akbar, they think like that does it. That doesn't do it.
But I'm talking about those kids that we hear. I'm talking about right now, not about the past. The past, I know we all achieved great things, and the parents achieved great things, and we discovered tons of things, but no more. You don't hear of anything scientific facts or any advancement or any, like the other day Dr. Khalid was saying, no centers at UCLA at all. You hear of all other centers, but no centers for Muslims. I mean, it's like a vicious circle. It's like where
Yes.
you start and how.
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about the kids, I'm talking about those kids' parents too.
When you say educate, yeah, exactly.
Because when they go home, they're the whole week they are with their parents, and if the parents do the right thing, that's one thing, but I hope I'm not offending anyone, but most parents think in the confines of cultural capsules, where if they look like Iranians, then that's right, no matter what they do, or if they dress like Pakistanis, then that's okay. So we are in the form. You know, that's why someone told me last time whether I was giving a fatwa or not. The point is that with the way I'm dressed, I can give 100 fatwas and nobody's going to even listen to it, because they have to look for my form, whether my form is quote-unquote Islamic or not. Not whether my words are Islamic or not. So long as we are in the form, we have given up the essence, and that is a problem.
Even your spirit, not just the words and the form.
My spirit is dressed so beautiful. Yes,
All right,
brother. There's one more question there. Then.
Okay, yeah, because we're gonna.
I was just wondering,
Just one
because, I mean, I love your message. It's all about peace and inclusivity and understanding others. But we got to a point where there are bad ideas out there. To what extent you will go out there and fight these bad ideas and stop it?
I've spent most of my life teaching, but you can never teach unless somebody is willing to learn. So the mouth and the ear go together. If people are not receptive, you can say the best thing in the world. If people are not receptive, they will use the term takfir and you're out. So the thing is that we have to create a culture that is receptive of new ideas, a culture that does not define Islam in the confines of a time and a space. And whether that time and space is the Mughal Empire in the 18th century India, or the Khilafah of the Umayyads in Damascus, 8th century. No, ideas die when you confine them to places and times. Religions die too, when they are regressive, when they look backward. but they thrive when they're forward-looking. Because in forward-looking things, there are hopes, there are dreams. You cannot live in a society unless you have dreams. Most of our people are not only asleep, physically maybe, but asleep in the sense of not having enough of it's the German word, Weltanschauung, a worldview awareness. But they also are dead in terms of not having dreams. They are all preoccupied with what to eat, what to wear, and whether my cell phone is seventh or whatever, things like that. So in terms of technology, we have plenty of it. Even in the Muslim world. Even here, I saw the other day, there was a homeless with a cart. There were a few things in there, and he seemed pretty miserable. But he had his cell phone, right? So, just having the technology doesn't make you technologically advanced.
It's his connection to the world.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it serves a purpose, that I understand. But the point is, we have to have our dreams that there is a tomorrow, and with the understanding that if there is a tomorrow, we better work for it. And most of us don't have the tomorrow. Most of us live in the present, many of us live in the past, not too many of us live in the future. And that's the problem. So we'll leave that for the future discussion.